Welcome to AHRC TV's weekly Roundup. This week's program examines the issue of enforced disappearances across Asia. We begin with Sri Lanka, where posters have appeared criticizing the annual commemoration of victims of disappearance. Next, we interview various experts. Samia Islam of Oidikar describes disappearances in Bangladesh evolving differently than in other countries. Mary Aileen Diaz-Bacalso, founder and the Secretary General of the Asian Federation Against Involuntary Disappearances, speaks about what her organization is doing to fight disappearances and support its victims. Emerlyn Gill, the legal advisor for Southeast Asia of the International Commission of Jurists, examines political obstacles to the international fight against disappearances. Welcome to AHRC TV's weekly roundup. I'm Josefina Bergsten. On October 27, Sri Lanka held their annual commemoration for the victims of enforced disappearance. For the last 14 years, the event has allowed communities to share their stories and grieve for those whose fate remain unknown. However, this year, the lead up to the commemoration has been marred by numerous posters attempting to slander the organizers. Numerous posters have appeared in Negombo, Colombo, and other parts of the country, accusing various human rights advocates, NGO representatives, and presenters of being dollar crows, trying to profit from the misery of the families they're trying to help. While the posters carry photographs of several notable figures in the fight against disappearances, there is no information identifying the source of the accusations. Exhibiting posters without such information is prohibited in Sri Lanka. The event organizers believe this is a deliberate attempt to disrupt the meetings, and complaints have been filed with the police requesting protection and investigation regarding the posters. The police, however, have not taken any action to remove the posters, prevent them from being posted, or trace those behind the campaign. The Asian Human Rights Commission has called the attack barbaric and stated that to target the commemoration is an attack on civilization itself, while calling for intervention from all international agencies and governments. This week's contribution from experts begins with Samia Islam of Oidikar, who explains the history of disappearances in Bangladesh and contrasts their evolution with those in other countries.
Obviously, enforced disappearance is a very serious problem in Bangladesh nowadays. Previously, from the war of 1971, it is continuing because very notable intellectuals were disappeared at that time, like Zahir Raihan, and afterwards is continuing in the dictatorship periods and self-determination movements like Kalpana Chakma, who was also disappeared in that time. On the other hand, the present situation is quite different from that, because we call nowadays it is democracy in Bangladesh. Actually, in practice, it is not, because who are disappeared, the identity of the victim shows that it's mostly because of different opinions and different thoughts they are disappeared. The state apparatus, state machinery are going to disappear them because they are very vocal against the human rights abuses and as well as for the political movement. So if we look at the histories of Latin America or Guatemala, El Salvador, or any other countries like Philippines, they were going through a civil war, dictatorships, insurgency like this. But in present context of Bangladesh, there is no insurgency, or there is no movement for self-determinations. But the statistics shows alarming situations.
Next, Mary Aileen Diaz-Bacalso shares information on what her group is doing to fight against disappearances and help victims across the Philippines.
So far, we have made some achievements. We were able to participate consistently and actively during the 3-year drafting and negotiation process of the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance in Geneva, at the UN in Geneva. So we tried our best to convince governments that we should have an international treaty against disappearances with an independent monitoring body, which is now the UN Committee on Enforced Disappearances. During the 3-year negotiation process, many governments would want to say that enforced disappearances is a problem of the past and it's a Latin American phenomenon only, but the presence of representatives in Asia and also in other parts of the world was a manifestation that this is a global problem. So it's one of the important things that AFAD was able to do, and AFAD continues to lobby for signatures and ratification for the convention. And in the Philippines, AFAD has been supporting FIND since its beginnings to lobby for enactment of a domestic law against enforced disappearances. And this law has been enacted, signed by the President in December of 2012. And this is the first anti-enforced disappearance law in Asia. So it would be good that if this law would be implemented, would be used, and that it can serve as an example for other Asian countries to do the same. And we hope that this can also expedite the process of the ratification of the Convention Against Enforced Disappearances by Asian countries. And we have also done something for families of the disappeared in terms of empowerment of the victims, because we believe that the struggle against enforced disappearances principally belongs to the families of the disappeared. So they have to be empowered. There are a lot of limitations, especially here in Asia, when most of the disappeared are from the poor. Their families are poor, so they are traumatized by the disappearance, and one of the devastating effects of enforced disappearance is the poverty, because most of those who disappeared were the breadwinners. So what we did was we conducted series of psychosocial rehabilitation sessions in different parts of Asia that was a recognition that of the traumatic psychological effects of enforced disappearance. And we had this program called Healing Wounds, Mending Scars, and then we had From Victims to Healers, and then Circle of Healing. Although it's also a challenge because we need a lot of resources for that to be sustained, and there are so many families of the victims needing psychosocial support. Recently, we organized the 3rd World Conference on psychosocial support in the search for truth and justice, which was held here in the Philippines in July. There's a lot of things to do at the level of the local organizations in terms of accompanying family members of the disappeared in their search for truth and justice. So these are more or less the things that AFAD has been doing since its beginnings.
Lastly, Emerlyn Gill of the International Commission of Jurists provides insight into the legal obstacles of non-interference in domestic affairs and the so-called Asian values doctrine.
The principle of non-interference, it's really a well-established principle in the ASEAN. This is even mentioned in the ASEAN Charter. And this is also included in the terms of reference of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, which is essentially what we have right now as a regional human rights mechanism. Unfortunately, this principle of non-interference is used by ASEAN member states to prevent any discussion on country-specific situations within the region. So for instance, when the activist Sombath Somphone disappeared in Laos a couple of years back, a lot of regional organizations, national organizations, and international organizations like the ICJ called on the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights to take on the case of Sombath Somphone. And we have been, ICJ specifically, had bilateral discussions on this case with some AHRC commissioners. Unfortunately, when some AHRC representatives broached this idea of discussing Sombath Somphone's disappearance within the AHRC, Laos, the government representative of Laos, objected to this type of discussion, saying that any discussion on the case of Sombath Somphone would constitute an interference in their internal affairs. So essentially there was a veto from the government of Laos. And since the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights operate on or make decisions on a consensus basis, one veto from a member state would essentially just shut down the discussion. Well, we look at other regions that there is more of an openness to discuss human rights situations in every country. We have looked at the mechanisms in Latin America, where the court, the Inter-American Court and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights have actually specifically mentioned cases in particular countries in their region. And we also saw how these two mechanisms in the Americas have pushed the boundary of human rights protection. So they have had really good decisions for further protecting human rights in their region. Well, the Asian Values Doctrine came about in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And this was, the main proponents of this doctrine were Singapore, Indonesia. So this was around the time of Lee Kuan Yew, Mahathir, Malaysia. And they were pushing this Asian Values Doctrine, which essentially says that the right to a progressive economy of the many is above human rights of individuals. But this, we would like to argue always that the Asian Values Doctrine has been debunked by the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, VDPA. So, and the VDPA has been adopted by Southeast Asian countries, including Singapore and Malaysia. There is a provision in the VDPA which essentially reaffirms the universality aspects of human rights. So human rights is for all people. All human rights is for all. So you cannot pick and choose which rights should be applied in your country. And that is essentially the argument that we're making with Southeast Asian countries. For the longest time, this Asian Values Doctrine has died down, but we see an emergence of that now here, especially in the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, which was drafted by the AHRC and adopted by the ASEAN member states a couple of years back. You see a lot of elements of the Asian Values Doctrine in the formation of the regional human rights mechanisms and its first instrument, which is the declaration.
That is all for this weekly roundup. For more on these issues, please visit www.humanrights.asia. Thank you for watching and see you next week.